Hello, and welcome back to the Leadership Link. This week, we're going to be deconstructing the four critical career levels of, or some might say, the only four career levels in the engineering side of things with Casey. Casey, nice to have you on.
Oh, glad to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. Good to have you. So, obviously, I came across you as probably most people have on LinkedIn. It seems to be where you're pretty active. So you're the founder of Expanded Skills, which seems to be specific around leadership training. Tell me a little bit just about your background and how you ended up sort of like launching Expanded Skills.
Yeah, I'll give the chronology and then spend a bit of time on what we're doing at Expanded Skills right now. So I came from a non-traditional background coming into the tech industry. So I came from the business side, and my parents were very entrepreneurial. So I was in that business environment growing up. Did finance for a couple of years before making the pivot into analytics and data science. Then landed at Accenture in their data science practice for a couple of years. Made my way up to leading engagements across the tail end, and spent a bit of time in their innovation hub as well, doing some pre-sales and client ideation, things like that. Then moved into my first leadership position when I moved into Manulife, leading their data engineering team. So we scaled our team pretty quickly from about 5 people when I started to about 30 plus when I left it 2.5 years later. So that was
Right.
the foray into leadership and engineering. Then I went back to consulting to consolidate both skill sets on data science and data engineering, heading up the Canadian practice for data engineering and analytics at Capgemini. Mostly go to market for the financial services sector here in Canada. Then recently I left to start my own company now, purely focused on the people development, talent development side of things, which has always interested me since outside of work, I'm quite involved in terms of teaching boot camp for about 4 or 5 years at BrainStation, and also been career coaching part time for 6, 7 years, and now getting into the training and coaching space full time. Yep. So that's a bit about
Amazing.
my
Yeah.
background.
Yeah,
Yeah, at
I
Expanded
saw. I
Skills.
saw.
Yep.
Obviously, you. Sorry, I was going to say. I saw you worked at BrainStation for quite a while. Like I've been doing a lot with sort of career switches and juniors and things like that, getting into the industry and how to help them, which is actually how this podcast spawned. Because I realized that there's now a lot of stuff for juniors getting into the industry and a lot of help and stuff like that, but there's not so much for like engineers going into management who are essentially like junior managers, which is kind of where this came from, funny enough.
Awesome. Yeah, like that's definitely an underserved space, I would say, which is a good transition into the thesis behind starting Expanded Skills and also the topic today, which is
Yeah.
as an individual contributor, there are a plethora of resources online, especially now. A lot of DIY training options that you can work on your technical skills, which is the primary component you need to progress up to more senior levels and the upper echelon of the individual contributor band. But after that point, the transition gets a bit tricky. So there is quite a bit of content on the transition nowadays from IC to manager, but beyond that, it's basically uncharted territory. There's some thought leadership here and there, but I found that whatever got you success up to the senior IC level, you cannot double down on that skill set. You have to build an adjacent and somewhat overlapping but different skill set altogether to progress up to the manager level and the two levels that we'll cover later on beyond that. Yep. So
For
that's the
sure.
thesis behind Expanded Skills, actually, is to pick up from the IC to manager transition point and then eventually build a glide path to how to navigate your career all the way up until head of and CTO levels.
Okay. Cool. Well, yeah. Let's dive into it then. So, like, obviously, as you broke down on the LinkedIn post that I saw, you kind of split it into purely four roles. Is that right?
I don't like to look at it as roles, actually. There are actually
Okay.
several roles between each band. I look at them as you're playing four different games with four different rules. So the IC game and how you're measured in terms of progress and what looks like success is one set of rules. And then the manager, you're switching into a different set of rules. And same with the manager of managers and being the highest of your function, being the eventual end game. The reason I highlight these four critical career levels is because whatever you do at your previous level, you cannot double down, being the optimal strategy to get success at the next level. You have to do something fundamentally different. And with a lot of conservative promotion policies going on to counteract the Peter principle, which is promoting someone into a role until they're not competent to deliver. The contrary to that is the conservative promotion policy, which you need to show competency at the next level for a considerable amount of time. On the short end of it, it's 6 months. On the longer end of it, I've seen up to 18 months before they promote you into the role. So if you need to work on a different set of problems versus your current role, you cannot take on more complex versions of your current problem and expect to showcase yourself as I'm qualified to be a manager, or I'm a manager, I'm qualified to be a manager of managers, like director and VP, because they fundamentally work on different things and they're measured on different things.
For sure. So how do you go about, like, obviously jumping from one to the next then? Like, so let's take from individual contributor to manager. Like, what's the fundamental difference between the two, and what skill set do you need to be developing outside of individual contribution?
Yeah, that's one of the hardest transitions, because the mindset shift is the biggest. As an IC, your throughput will matter quite a bit. So your individual contribution to what the team or project level measures as success. So how much code you can pump out, that's quality, being consistent, a consistent and unreliable contributor, and being able to fit into an existing workflow. So that means being able to fit into how people work, but making small suggestions of how the work can be improved here and there, being a good team player, and so on, right? So when you start off as a junior, you're delivering output at basically not as high of a quality as a senior, and less consistently and not as fast, right? So you can keep playing that IC game and optimize on those three parameters, being how high quality is your output, how consistently do you deliver, and how fast do you deliver, right? In that order. So if you optimize on those three parameters, you can go from junior to senior. And a lot of that comes down to your technical skills, hands-on ability to execute. However, when you get up to senior and you're trying to make manager, you're solving a different breed of problems now. You're no longer as an individual in that system. You have to zoom out at least one layer to say, how do I make that workflow for every developer that works within that workflow a little bit more efficient? So you're looking for things like process optimizations. Are people motivated by the right incentives? Is the tech stack you're using as frictionless as possible? Are they pumping quality code into production? If not, is there something wrong with the code review process? So these things are a different breed or a different class of problems altogether. And I find a lot of individual contributors, if they are trying to maximize team level throughput now, rarely is the most efficient strategy to actually maximize your own throughput. It's actually better to sacrifice a bit of your own throughput and fix a process so everybody who goes through that process improves their throughput. And
Sure.
yeah, that starts to fall apart as soon as you have a team of 5, where optimizing how much you can individually deliver just isn't the right strategy anymore.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I feel like one of the toughest things as well, obviously not always the case, but a lot of the time, particularly within smaller companies, the person who gets promoted is either the strongest or most senior engineer and is actually delivering probably the majority of, or like some of the most complex pieces of work. So all of a sudden, like, they've gone from being the person that delivers the majority of things to having to have the team slowly take over the majority of it. And I think the same can be said for sales to a degree. Like, you go from being the best to trying to make other people like better, but the immediate thought is, oh, let me do it. Like, I can do that. I can do this better than they can. Like, let me just do. And you end up kind of doing all, like you said, all 4 or 5 people's jobs for them, instead of being like, how can we get them to be doing their job better? You're kind of like, I can do their job better. And you're kind of managing through them as opposed to like letting them do their jobs. I find that's quite common.
Yes, because what usually got you up to the senior IC, or even a level or two beyond that, being at the staff or principal level, is you're usually known to be a very high level fixer. Like you said, the most complicated cases and bugs come to you, and you pride yourself on fixing that yourself, right? But then that's only half the equation that's needed to be successful at the next level, because you know what to do, but that doesn't mean like your team knows what to do. And more of it as you get more senior, it's about, can you train other people to get to not exactly your level fully on day one, but 60% of the way there, 80% of the way there, right? Can you take someone who's like 20, 30 and just accelerate their productivity to 60, 80 of what you're able to do yourself? Even before that, though, before training individuals, like you can purely work on alignment and removing, let's say, barriers between your cross functionals and get everybody's effort pointing in the same direction. That usually makes yourself a way more impactful person and a force multiplier than trying to work in the right direction yourself while your team is running around doing things that are tangential to the most important thing that needs to get done, or in sometimes in the complete opposite direction.
Yeah. So I guess making that jump from IC to manager, is it, do you think it's more of a like having to learn a new skill set, or is it purely the mindset shift that is kind of like the biggest blocker there?
It's a mindset shift first, and only then will they be able to open to learn the new skill set. So it's a sequential process. Yeah.
Yeah. And how would you go about, like, if someone has just become a manager or is on track to like become, like, how do you go about starting to think about that mindset shift?
Yeah. Typically, how I explain it to an engineering person is just look at like what you're optimizing for. You're optimizing for team level output now, not your individual level output anymore. So the strategies you need to embark to take on to actually optimize team level output will be very different than if you were an individual working within a process. So as soon as they internalize that, then they'll realize I don't need to be a faster engineer. That won't help me optimize team level throughput as much. I need to learn how to remove conflict, or I need to learn how to align people. Then they'll take what seems like the soft skills aspect of it a lot more seriously. Because a lot of times they label it as a soft skill, which is a topic for another day, which I think is a limiting belief. First is they need to internalize the mindset that these are actually very tangible skills that they need to learn in order to be their best version of themselves at the next level. So the mindset shift first, and then these are actually very concrete problems, like how to get alignment, how to build relationships cross-functionally, how to optimize your hiring funnel, right? Fixing your interview loop, finding bottlenecks in your process. These are things where it can be quantified down to more of a science than an art, especially if we borrow foundational ideas from other disciplines, such as systems thinking or thinking probabilistically from statistics and so forth. So these are actually pretty hard sciences. It's just not directly applied in the management context.
Yeah, it's funny because, like you said, it seems to be there's this, like you said, it's almost like a soft skill to be able to manage people. But you said there is actually a science behind it, and it's something that can be like. Would you say by pretty much anyone? Like, if you put the same thinking behind it.
I think so. But people are learning from the wrong baseline, which is a motivation why I got into this business. A lot of times, if you look at new manager training out there, you'll see a lot of variations of how to be a better taskmaster, even if they don't call it that. So they'll focus on things like, how do you delegate better? How do you communicate better? But those are not the first things you would think about if you were actually thinking about things at a system level. You would think about, how do I identify a bottleneck in a process? You wouldn't think about delegation first, right? A much more higher impact move is actually saying no to work that's non-critical, but that's contingent on you finding the real bottleneck in the workflow, right? So only after you find the critical task to be done, you go into resource allocator mode and you say, you do this, you do this, you do this, right? But you rarely start there. So for any manager who starts there, I know it's like built off of shaky foundations because they're not looking at the issue at the right level. So a lot of it is contingent on the training that you get, and like if you're lucky enough to get a mentor at that time, or if you're seeking out help in the right way. The communication aspect of it, I find there's a lot of training on how to remove verbal tics, how to articulate things better, how to build your vocabulary up. Those are not as important as your thought process, and more importantly, what you choose to think about. So there's two meta layers behind clear communication. if you're thinking about the right things and you have a clear thought process as you think about those things, the words will naturally flow out. But a lot of people, they just scratch the surface on saying, oh, I don't need to eliminate my ums, my ahs, and so forth. I and ah all the time, but the thoughts hopefully still get out coherently because I've thought a lot about the underlying issues and what deserves thought versus not.
For sure. I think I'm going to be super conscious of how much I am and are for the rest of this. So thank you for bringing that up. But I got brilliant. There's one. And another. So when you find people in that management level that are kind of stuck, like what would you say are the typical like major problems that they're stuck on, like, and some easy fixes for those people? Like where do you typically see people really struggling, and kind of treading water, as you said?
At the manager level, there's boils down to two archetypes. The first one is the heroic IC. I like to call the fixer. So they continue the pattern of individual contributor mode with good intentions to try and fix everything themselves, right? But that expertise doesn't really trickle down to their team, and like their team isn't overall better. And as soon as they're sick or they're no longer there, things fall apart, right? So it's like a very heroism type of thing rather than working on a system that's more robust. So that's the first archetype. The second one is the person who's running around in infinite meetings. I always complain about their calendar Swiss cheese. They don't have any time to think. That I think is they're just kind of in administration mode, trying to play a facilitator or coordinate things together, and they're overwhelmed. So that second archetype needs more of a lens on what is a high impact opportunity versus not. So one of the first things we do to develop is like, what do you typically say no to? So I'd ask them a thought-provoking question. What are three like nice sounding things that you said no to in the last month or two? And if they freeze and can't come up with an answer right away, then you know there's something wrong with the filter, which has a downstream effect of taking on too many meetings, too many work in progress items piling up, and so forth. So those are the two main ones. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of the second one kind of comes down to pretty much time management as a whole. So that actually giving themselves enough time to focus on the right things by saying no to not necessarily the wrong ones, but the less important ones. And I said the first one is just kind of trying to do everything because they think they know, or they actually do know best, but there's just a limit to the amount of people that you can get to do things when you're still doing the majority of the work. So yeah, like I think that makes a lot of sense. So let's go from manager to manager of managers then, like position or kind of like level number 3.
Yeah.
What's the biggest sort of difference between being a manager and being a manager of managers?
Things are no longer concrete. They're really, really abstract, and the time horizon extends. So there's a principle I like to fall back on that works for as you cross the 4 levels, which is the more senior you are, the more ambiguity you'll deal with, and the more the expectation goes up for you to provide clarity. And the third thing is it's going to be on a longer time horizon. So if you alter those 3 parameters, usually you have a good gauge of where you are on these 4 career levels. So from the manager to manager of managers, the time horizon extends significantly for the decisions you take. Usually a good indicator is a decision you make doesn't affect only one project, but any new project that comes into the workflow. So one of the things is if you fix how you evaluate candidates coming in, particularly senior candidates, and you change the rubric and how that interview is conducted or how you source for candidates, that's going to have long-term implications well beyond one project. Usually at a manager level, you're still able to dive into the project level tasks and even examine, let's say, JIRA tasks specifically as concrete examples to back up decisions you're making. But as a manager of managers, you're operating at a level above that, where you're trying to look at the macro and bigger picture, things in the abstract, so you could enable your managers to make better tactical decisions on a project level day to day. So it's really thinking in abstract terms, and you'll rarely ever have complete information where you feel fully confident behind your decisions. So that's where a lot of thinking in probabilities makes a lot of sense, having a good set of mental models to kind of pass through your decisions with incomplete information because you come in with strong convictions behind your ideas while remaining open-minded to new information as it comes in. So that's where it gets really, really abstract and people get very uncomfortable because they're used to thinking one decision has to tie to one task rather than one decision doesn't tie to a task today, but ties to maybe 20 tasks in 3 months, right? It'll impact like 20 things in 3 months, which is very, very difficult to grasp. And the feedback loop is usually interview loop fix, or if you make an alteration in your tech stack, you're not going to see the impact tomorrow. Versus at an IC level, if you ship bad code and it doesn't pass the tests, you'll see that 2 minutes from now, right? So the feedback loop is really, really delayed, and you can't really trace decisions perfectly to this was a good decision, so this was a good outcome. Really, so you have to develop kind of a mental model and strong convictions behind what is a good decision and what conditions are needed to succeed, because you won't have all the perfect information, but everyone's looking to you for answers.
Yeah, for sure. And like I read something a little while ago that basically said if a decision can be reversed, make it quickly.
Mm-hmm.
If it can't be reversed, then make it slowly. So when I guess as these decisions that they're making have more impact, like is it a case of just evaluating for longer and kind of like exploring your options more? Obviously, these decisions need to be made more slowly, but and I'm sure you'll come on to this, but I can see one of the biggest things here, people almost like being very hesitant to make a decision because of the impact that it's going to have.
Mm-hmm. So first, going in is knowing what you spend your decision cycles on. So treating your mental reserves behind decision making, it's a very, very scarce resource because 100 decisions will come to your desk, and 80 of them, like, you just have to make on the fly, or using a heuristic, or just filtering it out. It's like a non-decision. You just stick with the status quo. So you actually have the mental reserves to make critical decisions on the ones that like really, really matter, right? So like you said, like reversibility is one of the key filters. I like that saying by Jeff Bezos about the two-way door. And also even for critical decisions, if you get up to about 70% of the information that you would like to have to make a fully informed decision, that's usually the time to consider pulling the trigger, especially if it's non-reversible. But if it's low impact and non-reversible, then you just instantly make the decision, or you delegate to the line manager, who's usually closer to the area than you are, which is another mindset shift, which is up to the manager level. You're usually the most functionally proficient person of the space that you manage, right? But when you get it to manager of managers level, your coverage is so wide that it's actually a good thing that the people reporting to you at the manager layer, they're actually more functionally proficient than you are at their domain. But you're still expected to give guidance. So you have to shift from giving like functional guidance to more strategically, teaching them how to think through things, for example, rather than telling them this is the answer to this question.
For sure. So actually your job becomes, for the simpler decisions or like the easier decisions, like actually enabling your managers to make those decisions rather than making those decisions for your managers.
Yes. It's a huge hit on ego usually because you usually take pride in being able to be the most functionally proficient person and being into all the details and being the person that makes like the most accurate decision and giving the answers. Which is probably what got you up to the manager's level. But again, the rules of the game kind of changed, that if you go with that game plan, it's no longer optimal.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like it's a tough, we've got that here. We've got a number of managers that work here, and it can be quite easy if they come to you with what should I do about this? It's so easy to be like, this is what I would do. But instead of turning around and actually being like, this is your decision, like these are the options, this is how we're gonna decide what you should do, so you can do it, you can make the decision yourself. Like it's quite a hard quite a hard balance to send it back to them.
You're giving them a framework to make decisions, and you're telling them what is the most important criteria to consider and what information to gather and how much of it to gather, and when is a stopping point when you stop gathering information and you just need to pull the trigger. So you're coaching them on those aspects rather than actually the final decision itself. So you're setting up the frame for them to work in, so they make the final decision. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess where with decisions that you're making that are obviously bigger, you're spending more time on making those decisions because of the impact of them. But like you said, it can take the example that you said, changing your interview process, like it could take 3 to 6 months for you to actually see whether that's made a difference or not. Like how do you cope with not being able to see like immediate results of the decisions that you've made? Because then it must be quite hard to sit there and like if you were on the fence or like even though you've gathered all the data and you think you've made the decision, if you still weren't 100% sure, it must be quite hard to look at a decision you've made and just consistently day after day, week after week, be like, is it working? Is it working? Did I make the right decision? So like how do you get used to that?
The actionable thing you do is tell your team what information they need to go gather, usually through taking some form of action and validating, rather than taking that action yourself and collecting the information, right? So if you're not getting the information fast enough, then you tell them basically go through this process this many times and pay attention to these things and report back on these things. So you're fixing those parameters rather than going into the workflow yourself. Sometimes you do need to, though. So you need to take off your manager or manager's hat and put on your manager hat and just kind of like shadow them a little bit for the purposes of collecting the information and getting um, the primary take, right, rather than secondary information on that. So sometimes you do need to switch hats, but you're operating at a very abstract level. You're changing things of how they measure candidates, for example, in the interview loop, rather than putting yourself into the interview loop so you can gather more data from candidate interviews. But you do that selectively sometimes. Maybe you join one or two because there's something very specific that you're looking for. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess that could be one of the big mistakes, right? Like you change your interview process and then you're like, I will sit in on all interviews to check that this thing that I've decided to do works. Like so actually being able to give that to someone else to track for you, to feed back to you as if it's working or not, I guess is the way to do that, right?
Yeah, there's several models. The spectrum of top down and bottom up. Usually, when it's a completely like new idea and there's no reference models and it hasn't been really done before, bottoms up is usually the way to go. So you would be in the manager's seat for a couple of weeks or until like you reach a certain threshold that you feel like it's stabilized. So you would actually go in and like conduct the interview in the new way, right? And really
Okay.
like dog food your process. But then once you like have enough of that, it's again going back to that enabling your team to do it. So you're not trying to do it better yourself, but you're trying to know enough so you can train other people to do it well and then pull yourself out of the process again.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And same question as before, like how like or where do you see people stuck at manager of managers level? Like what's the typical like one or two I guess archetypes like you said previously of people that you see in this area that are struggling?
One that comes to mind is a person who has a lot of trouble detaching from details. So like they can't make a strategic decision without seeing the tactic. So it's thinking at a more abstract level where if I'm not able to generate something very concrete today and you have to act on information that's like a little bit more vague and it won't be like a month or 3 months before a tangible artifact comes out, you still have to like be comfortable with that, right? So it's adjusting to abstract thinking and being uncomfortable with uncertainty and knowing that accepting the fact that rarely things are binary. So it's not like this is 100% bad decision and it won't ever work out versus the other extreme. It's a good decision, I have full conviction behind it. And I'm going to go tell my CTO it's going to work out 100%, right? Like everything's in the middle. So it's really thinking in distributions and ranges and probabilities and adjusting those as new information comes in. So that's like by far the hardest thing. The other is letting go of your functional proficiency. So one trap is you're an engineering leader at the director plus level. You're spending too much time in engineering and you're not spending enough time with your cross functionals because you're very comfortable solving engineering problems and you know what to do and you have good rapport with your engineering team. But what you realize is they don't need more engineering problem solving at that point. They need someone to actually go fix the relationship with product, or they need to go tell the CFO why they should get funded for next year so they can have projects to work on in the first place. Or maybe they need a third-party provider, negotiate a partnership with a vendor, and bring some outsourcing muscle in, right? Those are maybe team things like people need from you, and you need to actively listen for that. And you can't really choose to work on what you're comfortable with and what you'd like to work on. You need to do what's required. Yeah. So it's kind of those two, traps that are the most common.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then jumping into the fourth one, so sort of highest in your function, whether that's CTO, or like you said, sometimes VP of engineering, head of engineering, depending on the sort of size of the organization. What's the jump and difference in role?
Yeah. The key, is behind the definition, where you're the absolute top of your functional domain, because like you're still a manager of managers tier, and a lot of the strategies and techniques we talked about there works until you are actually in what I call a one-of-one role. So there's only one of you in that function within the entire org, because the dynamics shift significantly because your boss is no longer from your organization. So your boss is likely the CEO or a mixture of the board of directors. So you have no direct management chain that is engineering related. So you can't really take engineering problems to them. They'll just ask you whether this is an engineering problem, or do you use engineering or don't use engineering to solve this or not, right? So that's one hat you have to wear. And then the other hat you have to wear is all the engineering problems do make it to your desk, usually through an escalation, or else it wouldn't hit your desk, are the most difficult and ambiguous engineering problems. So it's the most ambiguous across the longest time horizon, and they can't get clarity, and they're looking to you to get clarity. And there's no one up the engineering ladder that you can escalate it to. So you're on the hook for some of the like nastiest problems there are, and you're the furthest removed from the details, and you don't have even a peer to kind of bounce an engineering like solution off of. So you're the brains of it. You can provide frameworks like you do at the manager level to give your right-hand person, like the VP, a way to solve it, to stay within those parameters and so forth. But it's all on you to do. So yeah, you don't have another CTO within the company to solve it. So a lot of people operating at this level that I've seen, they all have semi-private communities and CTO circles that they talk to. So your personal network and who you know in the industry makes a huge deal here, because it's not that easy to get help within your company. So that's why the one-of-one role, the dynamics shift again from the manager of managers. It's not just looking at problems in the abstract, making high-stake decisions with incomplete information. It's you just don't have anyone to turn to.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I've never really thought about it in that way. Like, because obviously, if you're director of engineering, like, and you've got a real issue, where do you go to? You go to your CTO, right? Like, whereas if you're CTO, like, you can either speak down to like your team and get their decision, but it's already come up to you, so they don't know if it's coming to you in the first place. They don't know what to do, and then like you said, so the only person you've got to go to is likely your CEO, who wouldn't understand the problem as well as you would, let alone all of the people that have passed up to you. So I'm guessing the biggest thing you find people being stuck with here is not having that network, or not having the people to go and actually like share these problems with.
Not the lead domino thing. Like that's definitely an issue later on, but the most important issue or trap that they fall into is anything that's not fixed at the managers level. Now it's just exacerbated at this. So not being able to work well with your cross functionals, using engineering to solve every problem, like your hammer, everything's a nail, right? That really gets exposed because you're actually the face of engineering now, and you're dealing with cross functionals all the time. So you're dealing with your CTO, your COO, your CEO, board of directors. So if you're not good with cross functional relationships, and you kind of white knuckled your way through the managers level, then the warts really, really get exposed here. Or if you're not good at thinking on abstract levels and you need all the information before you're able to make a critical decision, things are just going to collapse at this level. So it actually exposes your flaws that you haven't fixed from your manager level. The external network is important, but that's a byproduct of how influential you are. So if you haven't been working on, let's say, your presence within the industry, do you have ideas that you're putting out there? Do you have a strong personal network? Those are all byproducts of not working on your personal influence and having strong ideas and backing them and so forth. Or it's like how you treat people is like a huge byproduct of how strong your network is, because they'll go on to other workplaces and they'll remember, right? If you actually took the time to help them when they're in need, or like actually contributed to their career development. So your network, and whether you're in those CTO circles or not, are all a byproduct of what you did leading up to your climb to CTO.
Yeah.
So yeah, all the words
I'm
get
sure that.
exposed.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a few pending requests from people to CTO circles that have never been looked back up because of the way that they were to other people in those groups, right?
For sure.
I'm always curious in those sort of groups. I'm sure you've been involved in them in different capacities. Like how honest are people about the problems within their own organization to other people at the same level within other organizations? Because obviously I'm assuming there'll be information that you can't share, because it's company information, but also like how open are people about like my department is falling apart? Like, do you know what I mean? Like how honest are people, and how easy is it to get like real feedback from people in those types of circles?
I'd say the wall that's put up is like a concrete wall. So if it's someone they don't know or like in the public domain, none of the warts really come out. It's just an aura that like everything's under control, right? Like we're doing state of the art technology here and so forth. It's a lot of, because you are like, the other factor is you are a public spokesperson at that level. So your media training and your presence and your ability to like speak on a podcast, all those things have an exponentially more valuable at that level versus if you were at the manager or like director level. So there's that. But what I've seen is once the other party has gained their trust and they look at them as a peer, they're usually very, very honest. So it's either that's a peer, or that's where a lot of executive coaching comes into play. That a lot of coaching is like, do you trust the other person as a sounding board, or do you see them as a peer that you do want to open up towards? So once they open up, the floodgates come out. But until then, it's a stonewall.
Yeah, I imagine it as sort of like an image of, I'm sure you've seen it before, like the top half of a person in like the sea being completely calm and like legs frantically underneath, being like everything's fine, like everything's fine. Like,
yes, the swan, right? That's picking.
Yeah, exactly. Oh. Well, no, I really enjoyed speaking with you, Casey, and I think like some really really good points there. I guess just tell me a tiny bit more about you, and if anyone wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to get in touch with you? Like, tell me a little bit about your course and how it works and all that kind of stuff, so people can reach out if they're interested in learning a little bit more.
Yeah. So the best way to reach me is just through a DM. Just find me on LinkedIn, drop a DM, or you can go to expandedskills.com to kind of take a look at like how I normally help people, what problems I help solve, and you can drop an email there if you want. Those are the two most direct ways to access. Yeah. So in terms of the course, so the course is actually covering a lot of what we talked about today. It's distilling the tactics and techniques that are needed to navigate these career transitions, starting from the manager level, and deliberately making it timeless in terms of applicability that's not dependent on trends and so forth. So a lot of the core ideas we've talked about, like how do you make quality decisions when facing uncertainty? How do you think about things at the system level, so you're not thinking as yourself as a component within a workflow, but be able to zoom out and look at things systematically and spot opportunities that are worth pursuing. And one thing we didn't touch on that the course covers is how do you just play for the long term? Because your career is 40 years, 40 plus years. So longevity is one thing that's not talked about enough. So there's a module in that course that's dedicated to how do you stay competitive across a 40 plus year career without risking burnout and resentment and so forth. Because a lot of us we're in a rush to get there really quick. But a lot of the gains in any industry are from being consistent and showing up every day and liking what you do. So there's a whole section there dedicated on how to navigate this marathon of a career.
No, thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, anyone that's listening, feel free to reach out to Casey directly to get more insight and obviously learn a little bit more about expanded skills. And yeah, anyone listening that has a new or a different topic that they'd like to jump on and discuss, or suggestions for future topics, it's either Chris Blakey at the Developer Link. You can email me at chris@thedeveloperlink.io, or just shoot me a message on LinkedIn. Thanks, Casey. Really appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.